Hey everyone, welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, talk about the art and the science of the things we are putting on our feet. Today, we have a fellow physio and amazing entrepreneur, and we got to go through all your titles, man. Dr. Jeff Moreno is joining us, and we have talked before, but I thought it was really important to get him on the podcast to talk a little bit more about what he does, because I know a lot of companies know. I think it's really helpful to know all the amazing thing that you're contributing. So, Jeff, thanks for being on. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I'm super excited. We had a great conversation last time, and it's good to just dive in deep a little bit more.
Yeah, it's great to dive in. Yeah. So you are both have a doctorate in physical therapy from University of Southern California. You're a board certified orthopedic clinical specialist back in 2006. You have a wide variety of interests, and you've done a lot of really cool things. Let me actually throw it to you to say, can you introduce your background a little bit and help our listeners learn a little bit more about you?
Yeah, well, I think, we both have a probably distinct passion for running. And so, I spent most of my career in the high performance and, working with, people from 800 meters to the marathon, trying to do their best and make it to the next level, which usually is the Olympic Games, right? And so, with, that, I think that kind of connects the dots from kind of our expertise as it relates to running. But I always tell people I'm an extremely confused physio. And the reason that I'm confused is because I never quite fit in the confines of the four walls of a basic physio practice, right? And so I had a background in strength and conditioning, and obviously I went to school to become a physio, and I wanted to do that since I was 16 years old. But I also have this like deep sports science research interest, and then I have also this coaching component as well. It stems out of just like a deep love for pedagogy and learning, and teaching how to learn. But what isn't confused, and what I'm never confused about, which sits right in the middle, which is the actual human themselves. And so that is always the thing that ties all those things together. And so being interested in all of those things and connecting dots from all those things, I guess led me on a really interesting journey. And so that journey happened to be starting or co-founding a company, and then doing what we're doing now, which I guess we'll chat about.
Yeah. So extensive background as a runner, treating runners, being someone who doesn't let a career or a title define them, which is awesome, because at the end of the day, we are human beings constantly striving and evolving over time. So this is awesome. But kind of going into what you mentioned at the end there is that it sounds like you were treating, and then an ultra marathoner, and of course, injured runner, as almost 50% of us become every year. Adam came to see you for treatment, and you started to see some challenge. Both of you saw some challenges, and ended up creating something really cool. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So these challenges were something that I was seeing for quite some time, and there's this backstory to that and there's a specific individual that came into my clinic at the time that I was working that really changed my life. And he happened to be not a runner. He happened to be a very young kid. And this kid was very dysfunctional as it relates to his movement. And I've been seeing this not only in the youth space, but also in the high performance space. And I said, like, it was so bad, I actually thought he had a neurological disorder. That's how bad it was. I actually asked colleagues, hey, tell me what's wrong with this kid. And they're like, oh, he has some sort of, neurological issue. And I'm like, no, there's actually nothing wrong with this kid. He just hadn't, lived in an environment that was conducive to the normal development of his being, right? Not only from a physical standpoint, but from a social standpoint. And so I kind of went on this sabbatical, and this sabbatical kind of led me to actually meeting Adam through another colleague, and treating Adam and et cetera. And as we were going through this process, I just started explaining to him this problem that I was seeing. And this problem is that, as a physio, we have access to these individuals for a very, very short amount of time, right? And they come to our office, or we come to the field, or they're traveling, or whatever it may be, however your space works. But when they're not with you, you actually don't know what's going on, right? You don't know what their story is, so to speak. And so talking to Adam, I was like, man, he had a data science background. He was a behavioral economist, working at Google and then working at another place at the time. And I'm like, man, I just want to deeply understand the individual story outside of the confines of my walls. And how can we do this with a data lens, right? Like at the time, GPS watches were becoming more and more popular, becoming more and more ubiquitous across the running space, as well as other wearable devices. This thing that we have in our pocket, is, I think, Apple. There's like 900 million people, using these, and then worldwide there's billions, right? And so, how do we take this data exhaust that everybody's producing, capture it in a way, and utilize that information to allow individuals, or for us to listen and allow individuals to tell their story? And that's really kind of how it began. And he said, well, I think I can help. Like, I think I can, let's play around. Like, let me take, a CSV file from my Garmin watch and pull that off. And like, let me start playing with what things I can get from it, et cetera. And that led eventually to the creation of a company called Power Lab. And so Power Lab's initial mission, and that was a consumer application that we created, a consumer app, was to really take kind of the current sports science literature as it relates to injury risk and running related injuries, which wasn't great, but we were going to try to do this anyway, and connect people's data in a way where we can kind of give them some awareness around potential susceptibility to running related injuries as it relates to risk of injury. And so we did that, and we spent a ton of money, and and it was super hard, and we had another person helping, and then another person came on, and it went from one thing to another. And all the while, a shoe company came sniffing around, and they said, we want nothing to do with your app. Actually, we don't like it. Like we don't like, and I don't know if they said we don't like it. It was just like, that's not what we're interested in. But what we are interested in is that you guys have managed to connect to multiple devices that everybody's using on a daily basis. And you're able to connect in a way that's first party. And we would love to figure out how to connect those individuals in a first party way to our R&D or innovation team in order for them to better understand humans in the wild, so we can better serve them through eventually product personalization of product and experiences and services that matter to them. And we're like, no, we don't want to do that. That's not who we are. Like we're running nerds that just want to like figure this problem out, right? But we got really interesting signals, and those signals were that like if people weren't hurt, they didn't care about their risk, right? They're like, we don't live in a society that is really proactive in one's health, right? We're very much a reactive society based on our healthcare, et cetera. And so eventually we came to the conclusion that, man, maybe we should listen to this company, and maybe we should change from a consumer application to direct to business model where we can actually serve these individuals and still be true to our core DNA, which will never change. And so that's how DashLX was born. Yeah.
That's awesome. So what I'm hearing is, by the way, so our subjective for those listening is, as Jeff mentioned, there is tons of data at our fingertips, right? So whether you have a Garmin Coros watch or you just have your phone, our phones are like, you don't really realize now, these things are supercomputers. So they are. I mean, not to get Big Brother on us, but they have tons of information. So our big subjective question is, how do you use the data given to you by the various devices you use, a watch, right, phone, that kind of stuff, or do you even use it? Because that's what I'm hearing, and I think the title of this episode should be. We'll see if BJ, Bach, and Nathan agree with me. But I like detecting signals in the wild, because you hit on this perfectly. That one of the biggest challenges as a clinician is you are really taking a snapshot of the whole person, and that's why I'm sure you were trained the same. The way I was trained, the way I train my students, is that your subjective is one of the most important things. Yeah. But the problem is people aren't always very good historians, and you may not get a full picture. And then you'll do some objective testing. You'll look at how they run. You'll look at some mobility, stuff like that. But you're still only getting a fraction of what they do. And we know that definitely there's good evidence that injuries, a lot of the fatigue issues we see are accumulated problems and not usually like this just random acute thing. Those happen, but it's typically more of these overuse type stuff, which is challenging because not just in this country, but worldwide, all the research, it's the same way. It's all reactive. Proactive injury predictive studies are extremely rare because they're extremely difficult to do. And people want to know more about what happened afterwards rather than go, how do we prevent this? Like I remember when I was, you probably know, we've talked about Dr. Chris Powers before. I remember I said the word prevention. He's like, don't say that's a bad word. It's like a dirty word in research. And I'm like, and later now I'm like, oh, that's why you said that, because it's so hard to do. But that makes sense.
Hard. Yeah. I mean, what you said, there's so many rich things in that. And one is the signals. And we'll get to that in a second, because that's a very important part of our technology. But I also want to come back to also what you said, because there's being a young clinician or being even now, part of what we're trying to somewhat decode is that time that you go into your doc's office or your physio's office and you sit there and you have this really intimate kind of vulnerable conversation at times, right? That's very back and forth. And to be honest with you, that's the most important part of my exam. And I call it like, I come in the room and it's very broad, as you know, and it's like, tell me a story. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, I want to know everything about your life. We have plenty of time. I'm not going anywhere. Right. I've been blessed with the opportunity to spend as much time with my clients. I know that's not always the case, but so I say, tell me a story. And we go through this discovery process, right? And there's a ton of questioning that goes on, and there's a ton of historical information that I want to know that's related to running, but even that they may think is not related to running, that matters, right? And I think of this category that we're creating, which we call lived experiences, is really the same. And the lived experience of a human is literally their physical experiences. And it's our job as a company to translate in that and digitize that and provide that to individuals or brands that they love that they can benefit from, right? And with permission. The data that comes out of that are like words in my subjective. And those words come together to create sentences, and those sentences create paragraphs, and those paragraphs create chapters. And if you get enough of those lived experience data words together over time, you start to have a very clear picture of this human living in their physical world outside the confines of the innovation team of a brand or my clinic, or anywhere for that matter. And that's really exciting to me, because as a young clinician, I just didn't get it. I was like, you can only come to me when you're hurt. I only get to see you this amount of time. And then just when things are getting good, I can't see you anymore. I'm like, this makes no sense to me. And you can't talk to me unless you are hurt or have a prescription because you're hurt. And so I actually see the change of this is actually not going to come from healthcare, right? It's going to come from things like outside of healthcare that have bigger influence. And our DNA is very pure, and it probably comes from the physios that you and I are, and every physio loves movement, and we want to promote movement, and we want to empower people's ability to thrive. And ours just happens to be, we're going to do that in ways where we can maximize data, or we can use the data to maximize their well-being, right? And so if we can do that through a brand that has influence in a positive way, and really start to shift the narrative of what this like funky thing called prevention is, or like taking care of a human in a unique way at a very personal level, it's totally worth the stress that I have every day.
That makes sense.
And so, yeah.
So it's interesting, because I think we've talked about this before, but I want to reiterate this just for the listeners, is that you mentioned something that is a core, and something that I'm starting to realize, and obviously we all keep fighting it, but a lot of the innovation and like the ability to make changes don't always come from these large industries like healthcare, right? They're kind of like these big machines that kind of have so many variables going on. They influence that. So, I remember when I was in PT school over a decade ago, I remember Shirley Sarman, and for those who don't know, she is like a godmother, like a legend in the field, has done quite a bit. Her. She's phenomenal. Yeah. For any of the PTs out there, while she's still alive, please go to one of her conferences and please get made fun of personally by her. It is an experience. For sure. I would really I encourage that. She's like, I think like, is she still in her 90s and she's still teaching?
I mean, she's amazing. She's
amazing. But I remember her talking about, like, I think the future of where health, not just physical therapy, but healthcare, is being able to be the movement experts, but also go, how do we start doing prevention, right? We know some of these things. We need to get more evidence on them, but we know there's certain patterns or lack thereof that might influence stuff. So why wouldn't people come visit us? Like just the same way you get a physical is come check in, make sure everything's good, so that you don't need to spend 8 to 12 weeks having to rehab something. But it sounds like you realized, I'm not going to get this done in healthcare. I'm going to need to be more efficient and go to somewhere where a large company has influence and is going to be able to use this data to influence a product that everyone, especially the ones that we're passionate about, are using. Right.
Yeah. And this is starting to happen in people like Jen and Brooks, and people like Christian Hyde and Adidas, and Andrea at Saucony, and all these individuals that we know really well. They're starting to understand like the bigger picture, and it's individuals like that are actually going to kind of make this change. And the change really is pretty simple to me. And they'll say the same too, is that if they want to sell shoes, it behooves them to have a human that actually is going to want to use the shoes because they're healthy enough to use the shoes, right? If a human isn't active or able to run, I mean, why do they need to hop on the internet or the site and buy the next best shoe? They're not going to do that, right? Matter of fact, we know the data says that the dropout rates or the return to run rates for someone who has had a running related injury is really bad, right? So there's a paradigm shift occurring, and it's at a very large scale, and I'm super excited about that. And so, what's the big change? Well, the big change comes from, how do we take this data that everybody's producing, this lived experience data, from their Garmin watch, from their Polar, from their Apple, from their Coros or their Suunto or whatever they have, and provide a pipeline or a connection point to a brand that they love and get value from that, right? And so instead of, them taking data from the website clicks or impression, no, you ask them nicely for it. You've invited them. The brand has invited them into their innovation lab. You're going to get something for it potentially, or you're going to be a part of a community, like for example, the Brooks Run Club. And then with that, we're going to utilize your data for X, Y, and Z. And it's with a purpose. That not only starts to create this really interesting community effect or flywheel, but it also builds trust. And you and I know as physios, the number one thing that can happen the most important thing that can happen on our first visit is to create this level of trust. And once you have that, things are pretty golden. But if you don't establish that, it's really, really challenging, right? And so we're on that path to facilitating that. And it's a pretty amazing path.
And you got to be really upfront, because I know there's good evidence that people form trust within the first 10 seconds of meeting someone. So you have to make a really good first impression and maintain that.
Yeah.
So especially when you take somebody's data and you're going, hey, would you please share this? We've got something to offer you.
Yeah. And it's just being authentic, right? We ask the brands to be extremely authentic and upfront. We ask them to say why they're using this information, and then actually go about doing what they say, right? And so whether that's a research project that they're doing with a specific amount of people on a specific shoe, or a university utilizing the information to actually do research on a running related injuries, or a feasibility study on using our data to facilitate that. It's just all about authenticity, right? And people can sniff that out really quickly nowadays, right? Because they're always being hit with something. And usually, if you're like me and I get that in an email form that has no form of personalization to it, I just delete it, right? It's just not worth my time, right? And so that's the change that's occurring. And once that change has occurred and they're facilitating that, then we can really start to do really cool things, and brands can really start to do really cool things. So from a data perspective, well, what kind of data is this? That's usually the question, right? Yeah. If I break it down into buckets, there's data that comes from you as the human, right? So there's your user demographics. And so as the physio, Matt, if I gave you a profile of a human, you have a 55-year-old masters runner who has a history of X issue, right? Let's say a calf problem, a history of calf issues, or, in their 30s, they might have had Achilles tendinopathy, never knee pain, usually in the lower leg. They run 3 to 4 days a week. They're getting slower, but occasionally they'll run fast. They're this weight, they're this height, they run on this specific terrain. They run at this specific time in the morning, every morning, and usually these distances. But then you get a signal that you're like, oh, you ran significantly more over the last 2 days. So that user demographic, you have environmental data, terrain profiling, elevation changes. You have other forms of data like speed, spatial temporal characteristics, your basic cadence, stride length. And then we have other proprietary algorithms that we've created that looks at or connects people's stride characteristics to kind of understand their specific running style. And that a lot of that was based out of Ben Van Oren's work, looking at running styles. And so we take all that stuff and then it creates a unique picture, right? And so then the next question we would ask, or we're getting brands to ask, is like, okay, if I have changes in elevation, I have changes in velocity, which can be a proxy for internal load of the bone or at the calf itself or the Achilles tendon, based on some of the work that we know, right? Mechanical fatigue work from Bryn Edwards. We can start to like think, this is kind of interesting, right? And if I knew this stuff and I knew their past injury history, and I'm having a continuous conversation with them through a triggered survey when necessary, then, I can start to think about, well, what type of shoe may this person benefit more from than another, right? If all these shoes were on a spectrum, and let's say the spectrum was like a triangle, and there's at the top of the triangle, there's a more minimal shoe, and at the other edge of the triangle, there's a more elastic shoe, and at the other one, there's a more cushioned shoe. Like, then we can start to hypothesize, based on these signals that I'm getting from this human, what would I put this person in potentially, knowing that the shoe is like, to us, it's just a load manipulation tool, right? And so then we can go from there and even dig deeper. And this is where it gets super uncomfortable for brands right now, to be honest, but not me. I'm like, let's do this. I'm totally into this. Like, okay, if we potentially can hypothesize about a better shoe, we're not saying perfect, but better shoe potentially, then can't we also potentially hypothesize about maybe some of the physical things from a capacity standpoint that this individual might want to work on if we only give them 3 things? Let's just give them 3 simple things. But how cool would it if they got a text saying, hey, I noticed this. We find that when these things match up, that it's really beneficial to do this thing in the gym. Or this type of a movement thing. That's uncomfortable for people because they're used to waiting until that guy has a calf strain or Achilles tendinopathy from running too fast because he hasn't run fast. He's 55 years old and he hasn't run fast in a year, but he did a race randomly. And all of a sudden he spun those wheels and now his Achilles hurts, because its capacity at his lower leg is really low. And the elasticity within the tendon is less than it used to be. We kind of know those things, right, Matt? So,
yeah.
So
that's literally what my dissertation is on. So yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I'm like, did he choose this just because I'm doing Achilles calf stuff and masters runners? But yeah, it's true. It's totally true. And you got the data is basically that an insanely accurate part of your subjective objective exam. And I don't think that's uncomfortable at all. I think it's great, but I understand why they might be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So you can't use words like prescribing, which is probably good, but you can,
that's fair.
You can recommend things that I think are fair, but how cool would it be for a human outside of the confines of us or outside of the confines of a brand, but connect to the brand, to get a text from a brand saying, man, you're doing great. I loved your run today. You ran 6.5 miles at this pace. You had this much of elevation change. You're rocking it. Hey, I think based on what you're currently doing, I know you bought this shoe, but you might really enjoy this one. When that other shoe's done, check this one out. And by the way, try these things. And here's why. That would be so amazing, right?
It would be, because you got a couple components. Building the relationship, and life is hard. Right. Yeah. And not to talk down about this, everybody, social media, we're on our phones so much. There's a lot of negativity out there. There's very good evidence that being on social media actually has impact on your psychological and your mental health. And we know that. So to get some positivity going, hey, you're doing great. We're looking out for you. We're not trying to sell your product. We're just saying, hey, when you're interested, this might be a good option, because we know that varying your shoe choice is one of the few things that reduces injury. But then going, hey, we're not going to say it like this, but we know almost 50% of runners get injured every single year, right?
For sure.
We don't want that, right? Because like you said, then people don't run. The dropout rate's really high, which this is where, I won't go off on this tangent, but for masters runners, this is why I was interested in my population for my study, because as we get older and things get more challenging, the dropout rate tends to increase. So that what we need to start figuring out, how do we either help people get back faster, or how do we try to prevent injuries in the first place or reduce them? And if you can do that through, hey, and all clinicians have had that experience going, you know what, if you just did this like one thing or got a notification, educate. A large part of our interventions is education. So what if we could give that to people beforehand and teach them these things so that they can figure out, oh, you know what? There was a little too much elevation today. I'm going to need to back this off because I know I got a great benefit. It's a great run, but I know based on my history, I need to modify this. Then I'll get back to it. Like that, the education and the prevention is key.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be prescribed. It can be, this might be a good thing for your movement health, right? Or your movement proficiency.
Yeah, totally. And just having, we call it from a self-determination theory, right?
Yeah.
We call that relatedness. Like people, besides wanting competence and autonomy, they also want someone on their shoulder looking after them, right? And I think using lived experience data and capturing specific signals that then can in turn trigger actions, whether it's from an external motivation standpoint, putting them into something that may potentially feel better for them, based on capturing a bunch of information over time and learning more about those things, I think is the next wave of how people are going to be taken care of. And it's really, one brand told me last week, they're really like going, and this was a massive shoe company, and I almost fell out of my chair. They're like, yeah, we're really going away from just this idea of like, shoving shoes down people. And we just like really want to be known as the caretaker brand. We just want to take care of these individuals, because if we do that, like all the other stuff from selling shoes to, people being invested in brand affinity, it'll just kind of take care of itself. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so right. Please do that.
Awesome.
Right?
Finally moving from like short-term sell as much stuff as possible, going long-term. If somebody's going to come to us and choose us as a brand, it's how do we like show our appreciation and make sure we take care of you equally, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And then, I think I love all the gadgets, right? Like you're in the lab right now. You like, we have force plates and we have 3-dimensional, Viacom systems that we can all nerd out on. But also sometimes the simplest things are like usually the most effective things. And so how do we take a very complex process and capture low friction data that can like create simplicity around this, and understanding all the craziness is important, because then you can use that to facilitate proxies that in turn kind of tell you similar things. And so that's what people in the labs are doing right now with this data, is that they're taking the connection of the environment, the human, and the task of the running itself, and combining these data sets together to really answer what real runners want, right? Real runners, and this, and this is why you have an amazing podcast and do shoe reviews, because what do runners want? They want to know, like, there's 5 billion shoes out there and I have no clue what shoe to buy. Just tell me what shoe to get and I'll buy 3 of them, right? Like, how are they supposed to know? It's like crazy, right? And so people are trying to kind of understand that and make that more accessible. The other thing, and you know this because you just had the podcast, is they're trying to understand durability of the midsole. So like people can figure out, well, when do I replace my shoes? And in doing so, you learn more. Well, like maybe the durability of the midsole is a lot greater than we thought it was, but we still have the outsole and the upper to deal with. And that's probably going to wear down quicker than the midsole itself. And then it depends on the type of runner, right? One of the guys you talk to has a crazy stride. So, and it's really long, and like he wears down shoes different than myself. And so it's different, right?
And the rest of his team calls him the Destroyer. Yeah.
Pretty much. He runs through shoes like crazy.
That's why he started a shoe website, hoping he could deal with it. Yeah, just kidding. For those listening, this is me, by the way, that ruins shoes. But
so I mean, there's really cool things, and then the basic things like, it does come back to injury risk too. When we started this and we started connecting to lived experience data to brands, they really didn't want to touch that. Like it was just a big no-no for the brand, right? There was just a lot of difficulty legally having to deal with verbiage and language, and you're talking about injuries and that's not our domain, right? And how do we deal with this? But 3 weeks ago, I get an email from someone. They're like, "Hey, if we were to do this, what would this look like?" And I'm just like, yes,
finally,
yes,
Won
finally, yeah. So I'm like, okay, let's do this really carefully, and we're going to do this really slowly, and we're going to be super methodical about it. We're going to be really simple because I don't think it needs to be complex, right?
Got it.
So
weird question for you. So you've had this vision, and I think a lot of, especially in the clinical, have been like, if we could just figure out how to use you pioneer, right? Like, how do we use this data? What do you think? And you may have already mentioned it, but I'm just curious. What do you think the turning point was for a lot of these companies to finally go, actually, I think this, let's take this. What do you think the turning point was?
Yeah, because I think there's a big disconnect between what they're capturing in the lab and then what actually is occurring in the wild, right? And we know this to be true from what people say is often very different than what people do, right? And so they're capturing a lot of information, and a lot of that's done qualitatively through subjective surveys. But they get the shoe back and it'd be like hardly worn, but they said they ran 500 miles on it, and they're like, how is that going to help me building a better shoe for a greater population, right? And so I think it always starts, it's easier to start in the innovation and R&D departments within these brands because they're not always scared of lots of big data, right? They are used to using numbers and having a little bit of chaos, as in your PhD work, and dealing with the uncertainty of what you're trying to study and how things just don't always go right. They're okay with that stuff, right? So that was the turning point. It's hey, we need to figure out actually what's going on out there, and we need to be able to communicate better with the people that we're trying to bring into our brand and take care of. And the only way to do that is actually to capture their lived experience data in a way that is authentic and personal. So it's taken a while, and it's still an educational process for these brands because it's so different than the status quo, right? And so but I'm very thankful. I'm honestly just giddy every time I get to hang out with these individuals and all these different brands to get like a little peek underneath the hood of what's going on and what's potentially happening in the future, right? And it's just super exciting. One, just because I'm a running nerd, and like, what better thing for a running nerd to just hang out with people in these brands, right? And talk shop.
Yeah. It is super. It's also really great that, like, just like yourself, all these people are actually really awesome human beings. Having had them on the podcast, been fortunate to meet a couple of them in person, like, they're really cool. So it's not surprising to me at all that yourself and a lot of these wonderful people are like coming up with this stuff. Like, how do we just basically at the end of the day, it's how do we make the world a better place, right? We get people more active, we keep them active, but it's the challenges, like, you know, that engagement, figuring out what to do. This is slightly off topic. I'm laughing when you're mentioning like the chaos and learning to ride that as someone who I should track my heart rate metrics while I'm testing people as I'm panicking and trying to keep a straight face as something's crashing and I'm trying to manage that at the same time. Going, nobody told me this is going to be this stressful. I thought like, oh, you just collect this data, not like, oh, Qualisys, our motion capture has crashed for the 8th time today, and the AMTI force plates aren't connecting because they're having a temper tantrum. It's like, so yeah, it's learning to ride that chaos, which I think having that data, right? The chaos of either a brand or a clinician talking to somebody going, how, like, you got so much going on in your life. How do we start organizing this? And I think that's kind of what I see is like you're organizing this into bite-sized chunks. You can go, oh, we can do, we see this. Here's what we as a team including the person that's providing the data can go, hey, this is what we might be able to do with this, which is really cool.
Totally. Yeah. That can get dangerous because I usually am the one to like go down those rabbit holes because there's so much that's possible, right? But then I have to step back and say, okay, let's just keep this simple. Let's let's walk, run, let's crawl, walk, and run in that order. And but yeah, it is pretty exciting. We're learning as a brand though that we actually need to make it the process of this simple, because you throw sample level data onto the table of someone or workout level or a thing we call it snapshots, which is like a snapshot of someone's kind of 3-month history. And it's overwhelming, right? And so we've learned to like step back and say, hey, what are you guys trying to do? Let us figure out kind of the best way for you guys, and then we'll like serve it on a platter and we'll take that to the very end. Because they, like, how it's like today for you is crazy, right? If I said, hey, I'm going to dump off like, 1 million points of data on your in your computer, and you're gonna pull it from our API, and like, that's just more work for you. So it's like, it's these problems that I didn't even consider. I was like, oh yeah, we just do this, and like, boom, and here's a shoe. Here's like, or like, here's, you do this, and like, okay, you push a button, and then, you tell them, hey, I need you to do some calf capacity. Your soleus is super weak, or I'm hypothesizing that because everybody's is, right? So, like, it's a lot harder than that, I'm learning. But that's why I have amazing people on my team that are way smarter than me. So they can do that. I just get to talk to people like you, which is more fun.
It is fun, but it's interesting what you mentioned, because what I heard was there's so many possibilities of things to do, and you got to the point where you're like, you let the brands tell you what they need, also probably the individuals what they need, right? And that is the hallmark of a master clinician, is when you're younger, you generally tell people what they need. As you get older and you have more experience, you go, I got all this stuff. What are your goals? You tell me, you guide me. Where do you want to go? And I'm seeing that parallel here.
Yeah, and this is something that we also learned very painfully is, and this was with the Power Lab thing. We were considering that, or under the impression that people wanted to be healthy proactively. but they actually didn't or want it, right? Like we are actually under the impression they needed it, which they did, but they didn't want it. Like that's not what they wanted. They don't know. That just isn't part of their vocabulary, right? Based on how society works for us. So, so stepping back and transitioning to, working directly with the brand, it's like, okay, I got to understand that, my needs are not always the same as their wants, or their needs. My idea of their needs isn't always the same as their wants, right? So I think that was a very important thing. And it's something that I'm still learning, that I have to just step back and say, okay, I want to take you here because I think it's important for humanity. But that's not maybe where you're at, and that's okay, but we'll get there at some point. So let's just deal with what you want right now.
Right. And that comes from just asking the right questions. So it's both you're having to ask the right questions. The brands are also having to ask the right questions of the consumer going, what do you want? Right. That's where we're testing. That's where all these surveys, outreach, focus groups come in and going, what do they want? So that's interesting. So a couple quick questions on that. So if we start at the individual level, what kind of metrics have people wanted? And is there anything that they might want that they don't even know is actually readily available to them data-wise? I know it's a broad question.
Yeah, that's a really, you're talking on the consumer side.
Yeah. Let's start with the individual first before we go up to the
for the individual, it's really simple to me. Like for the individual, and I hear this all the time, and I know you hear it if you're working with runners, right? They're like, and for us as a clinician, usually this is on the top of the list. Why did I get hurt? Like, what's wrong with me? Tell me the diagnosis, which doesn't really matter to me, to be honest with you. And then how can I make sure that this doesn't happen again? Unfortunately, that's at the end. It's not the first thing. And then close second to that is like, again, tell me the best shoe. How many times you have a runner come in just like, hey, they bring 15 pairs of their shoes all in a bag. They throw them on the floor and they're like, one, can you look at them? And I'm like, okay, cool. And then two, tell me what should I get? Right? Like, what do I need? Right? And that's kind of a loaded question because there's a lot into that. But we're starting to see patterns. We're starting to see patterns with, shoes that have greater longitudinal bending stiffness. That's a problem. We're starting to see patterns with shoes that have higher stack heights and that are very compliant foams, right? And we're starting to see, and we've seen patterns with, these low profile shoes for quite some time, right? And so we're starting to kind of see these things, and they're not causative, but there's correlation to specific types of injuries. And there's also correlations to specific types of patterns of movement that these individuals come to the table with that are not always easily modifiable based on their motor patterns and their habits, right? And so, but that to me is super exciting. And I think that is kind of the future of where this is as an experience or a service that the shoe company can provide is like, hey, we noticed, and I'm going to tell you one, we noticed that you have this specific pattern when you run. And that pattern is that you spend a ton of time on the ground. And when you do accelerate, you get longer instead of turning over more. And with that specific pattern and at these specific speeds that you run at, we see more individuals with patellofemoral pain. Have you had knee pain? You're like, yes, I have knee pain. It starts here, and sometimes it's on the outside of my knee, and sometimes it's in the front of my knee, and it's a real pain. And I'm like, yeah, it is a real pain. And so we're capturing these signals uniquely. There's also some signals in the lower leg that starting to we've seen some correlations to individuals with bone stress injuries or Achilles tendinopathy. And a lot of this work just like was hypotheses that I had, and then you connect them to what it says in the literature. And then you're like, okay, can I capture this with this data? Can I capture those signals? And then with that signal, is it possible to trigger something? And it is. It totally is. There needs to be a lot of work around that. But one of the biggest aha moments I had as a clinician was like, everybody told me for the longest time that like the most common running related injury is knee pain, like anterior knee pain, in a specific population. And I was like, I don't know. I haven't seen a person with patellofemoral pain in 5 years. And I was like, And I see I only see runners. Like I don't see anything else but runners. And I'm like, why is that? And it was like slapped me in the face. I'm like, well, like all my runners are like super fast. Right. And so when they hit the ground, there's very little knee flexion that occurs at the tibiofemoral joint, right? The loading as a result of that at the patellofemoral joint is actually quite a bit lower than someone who's flexing excessively during loading phase or mid stance, right? And I was like, oh my gosh. But you know what I do see all the time? Bone stress injuries, Achilles tendinopathy, yep. Like everything you can imagine at the foot, right? And that was like my biggest aha moment. And I was like, whoa, can I see this pattern? Can I take data and see that pattern, capture that signal, and then do something with it proactively? And I was like, I think I can. And now I just need to get these other people who have influence that other than me is the N of one, to like do something. But that's super exciting to me, man. And like, cause it isn't rocket science, right? Like right. We see it every day.
Yeah. It's trying to translate it. Yeah. It's translating it to not only the world, but like companies and other people. Cause we're very lucky to have the jobs we do. We're super awesome. The thing is we always will have patients because people are always going to get injured. If we can cut that down and keep people healthier, that's part of the prevention part, which I think is really important within our profession. Even if we reduce the injuries to like 5-10%, people are still going to need us. But if we can help people stay healthier longer, it's the long-term effect of keeping them active. Because the worst thing people can do is you get over an injury and then you just stop moving. And then you start getting all your other comorbidities, your high blood pressure, your like diabetes. So it's like that. And once you go down that road, it's really hard to dig out. So prevention-wise, this makes total sense to me.
Yeah. So, So, and then you have other components like marketing and, which, is like it starts to spread, but just more authentically and naturally, I think, in a better way. Yeah. A better way. I like to think of it as a better way. Yeah. So,
so you talked about this a little bit, but so footwear companies are not only using this to get an understanding of who the population they're serving, right? They're creating product for, but there's also some talk of how can we modify this to make footwear that better matches people, correct? Is there anything else that they're utilizing this for in terms of benefiting the consumer?
Yeah. So again, that we call that finder tech, and companies are really interested in that, right? Is like in a scalable way. We're not talking putting someone in a foot scan or like pressure insoles, like that's just not accessible to the normal individual, right? But one major company was just like, we're just tired of getting like our customer service just like getting hammered right now because people are calling in and they love the brand, and you would know this brand. People, it's like an up and coming, really cool brand, but they're like, the reason that we got contacted is because their customer service is so fed up with being asked, like, I want to buy a shoe. I just don't know what shoe to buy. Right. And so I can tell you one company, and this blew me out of the water. Like I literally almost fell out of my seat. They're like, man, if we can do this, this, and this, like if we can like be able to potentially hypothesize about a susceptibility to something or a signal that is like, man, they haven't run in a month. Like, can we, could we send them a survey and say, hey, are you injured right now? They actually said, if we can do that, man, then maybe we can refer them to a physical therapist in the area. And I almost like fell out of my chair. I was like, whoa, like a major $1 billion brand is telling me that they want to send their customers to physical therapy because that is probably good for the brand. If, I was like, the world is changing for the better. And I'm super excited to be a part of this process.
That's super cool. So you've got, it's going, go for it.
I've just never heard anything like that before. I was like,
which it makes sense. You got to take care. You got to, if you're going to create a community, you got to take care of your members, right? And so if they can't run, they're injured, right? That they're not going to be happy, right? So I mean, and from a business standpoint, obviously they're not going to continue running. They're not going to purchase product. So it makes sense to going, all right, how do we keep you healthy? And go, yeah, sometimes people do need help, right? People need to have self-efficacy, but sometimes they just need that, like you said, the hand on the shoulder to go, hey, you know what? I know this is rough. You're going to get through this. And if you need a little bit of help, here's someone that might be helpful for you. Like that's awesome, totally. Right?
Yeah.
Talk about support.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So they would call that a service, right? And so you have product personalization as one piece of what brands are looking to do. And then you have another piece would be a service. So that would be a service. And then you have the third piece, which would be like creating experiences, right? And so like from a community standpoint, how do I get people that are of like mind and like, I guess, physical ability and put them together in an opportunity where like they're probably going to just enjoy each other's company, right? I often say that, like all sports are made up of movement, but not all movement needs to be sport, right? And so if I translate that to the running world is like all runners run, but not all runners need to be Boston marathoners, right? And so I really have even though I work with kind of the higher end, runner, like I really have a heart for just people who, use running to feel better and reduce stress. And because in theory, that's like the majority of runners, right? Like if you look at the Boston marathoners, like it's just a small sliver of the actual population that utilizes their shoes, even though, we're interested in the bouncy, foamy, resilient things that are stiff and do cool things for people. Most people shouldn't probably buy those shoes.
I'm happy to hear that. I know we get super excited about those, but we know there's always appropriate. So, and it reminds me when I was talking to Jen from Brooks, we had her on here and she was awesome. And it was like, yes, we get a lot of focus on the elite runners and there's nothing wrong with that. We have to realize that the majority of people aren't elite and that's okay. And we want to make sure that they know that we are designing product for them. And we want to make sure everybody feels heard, everybody has a product. And that's really important, not just from a clinical standpoint to go, and one of the, you mentioned this earlier, right? During the examination, your first visit, gaining trust, but also making sure that person feels heard, especially in a society, in the medical community, like that's people get not heard all the time. They get talked over or stuff like that. And I'm sure people sometimes feel like that in the running community, like, oh, I'm not an X fast marathoner or 5K, why are they going to pay attention to me? And it's like, well, no, we want you to be heard. And so I think this allows that connection.
Yeah. And, I love Jen to death. Like, and she is absolutely the biggest proponent to, serving that population. And that's why I think she's at Brooks and she's doing what she does. And that's why Brooks, absolutely knows who they are as a brand. And because of that, that's why they're really successful. Right. And so, I think they'll continue to serve that population as well as others very well as a result of people like Jen and others on that team. Yeah.
But that's awesome. So you got how the companies are using this. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of individuals might not know what's available to them. So if you would, we're going to go back to the rule of three, right? If you could tell people, hey, there's 2 or 3 things, 2 or 3 metrics that you just have easily available to you that might be worth paying attention to you, what would those 2 to 3 metrics be? And I know we're asking a directed question rather than getting the information of going, and you might already know, but like, what do you think would be most helpful for people that don't know to pay attention to?
Yeah, I'm going to really generalize this because, and I'm going to take it away from just completely like a specific variable, because I think the importance of lived experience data is translating this into something that's accessible and actionable for a real human, right? And so if I said, hey, we know that there's some decent evidence as it relates to cadence and, manipulation of gait around that, and specifically with people who have pain, maybe less so with people who don't, right? And specifically around the knee, or maybe even into the calf or some plantar fascial issues, right? And that's cool, but that requires a little bit of me and you being around them and helping them through that process potentially, right? But I would say, hey, I got a thing, and I call it the 3 C's, and these 3 C's I think are probably what I define as being pretty important. And we're going to simplify this for you. The 3 C's consist of consistency, right? Correct loading, whatever that means, and we'll describe it. And then what I call control. And so consistency, and we've done this study with one of these brands, is like looking at the correlation of consistency to running injury. And it's like extremely clear, like people coming into a specific thing or coming out of it, if they aren't consistent. We define consistency as running at least 3 days a week in a 7-day period over a certain time span. They just happen to get injured more, and it's like pretty intuitive. So let's just, if you're going to run, I don't care about volume. Let's just focus on kind of getting consistent, and that looks like this, and then let's build upon this. And so that's important. And you can use data to do that, and this brand will use that data to do this. And then there's correct loading, and what does that mean? And that means like, well, if I am going to run and I am going to be consistent, I probably need to do it in this fashion. And that fashion is like, well, I'm going to focus on frequently moving. And that movement might be in the form of walking first, or that movement might be in the form of running. And we're going to capture those signals and help you through that process. And then the next thing is like, well, I might add a little bit more volume onto that, and that will just naturally happen. And at the very end, I might tickle that with some speed every now and then. And this is how we'll do that. And that's how we're going to correctly load. And we might have some fancy stuff that some fancy researchers did, that is cool. But like, that's pretty basic, right? And then the last thing is control. What does control look like? Well, if I go out for a run, and I'm going to ask you this, Matt, this is your test. What do most runners do from an intensity standpoint, or like a pacing standpoint, when they go out for a run? Like, what's the most common error that they have at every level? And I can think of one of my professional runners right now is like really bad at this. And I can think of one that's changed, and like she's, will be in Budapest this in a month or so. What's the most common thing?
I will say this, and hopefully I'm not wrong, because I'm going to call my wife out, who is also a professional athlete at the moment and hated training with me because I do the exact opposite, because I was very lucky to have some very fast people teach me this, is that people start out way too hard. Whether it's a race, whether it's their run, they start out way too hard rather than warming up into it. And my wife hated that I would start out 9-10 minute pace and then finish faster. But
it's just like their pace is like probably too high, especially on the easy days, right? Like they're let's say someone, and I have this woman is really amazing, but she's like was running her easy paces like maybe coming under 7-minute pace, like after a really, really, really excruciating hard workout, right? And like what she said was like the one thing that completely changed my game was like not running any of my easy days under 8-minute pace, which felt like I was walking. Like she literally said, that felt like I was walking, but I am now crushing it. And that's Elise Cranny, to be honest with you.
That's awesome.
So like, and she's pretty good.
It's pretty solid. That's a little understatement, but yeah.
Yeah. If she can run her easy runs at 8-minute pace, like why shouldn't other people run really easy? Right. And so, those three things I would tell every human, and I would tell them over and over again until they got it. And then you can obviously we can layer in data to this and signals and triggers. And if I'm going to tell a brand, hey, where should you go as it relates to prevention of injuries? I'm going to start talking to them about the 3 C's, and maybe I have already done that.
But it sounds like when talking to people using this data this is already available. So if you have a GPS watch or a phone, like you can track your mileage and you can start looking at patterns going, hey, you know what? Talking about consistency, right? How many days a week are you running? Or the other thing is, if you're running frequently, do you have huge spikes in that consistency of volume? Those spikes are where those injuries typically tend to happen or after, because your body's, the more consistent you are with the more like equivalent load, the more your body's kind of ready for it. It's those big spikes, got to be really careful. Little spikes, okay. That's how, if you're doing a workout or that's how you push yourself to get better, but it's got to be appropriate. And you got to heal from it. The second it was consistency,
correct
load, knowing going, hey, am I suddenly jumping up or am I doing things appropriately, slowly building, which our bodies don't do this really well. They do this really well. So again, looking at your mileage, going week by week, what's happening. And then the final thing is control, going, the watches, the phones, they all look at pace. So going, how do I know what I'm doing? And how do I keep that under control? So instead of running 6:30 pace on an easy day, you go, that's not necessary, especially from a load management standpoint. That's going, what's the purpose of today? And if it's to recover, let's make sure I'm comfortable with this. I'm controlling this. I'm not letting my things get ahead of me.
Yeah. And as a physio, this is like right up our alley, right? I mean, when we look at a treatment stem, like we're, the biggest thing is we're building awareness around something, right? And then with awareness, we build in context, maybe with a movement or maybe without a movement. And then we're working to transfer, transfer that idea into something that's more makes sense, which is the act of running. And then we're looking to stabilize this over time, right? And that's like a very basic treatment model that we go through. And so that awareness piece is really big. And for my runners, if we're talking about pace, I'm talking about is pace, and this is like beyond this, but I think it's cool, does your pace match your effort? And if it doesn't, like there's something wrong, right? And that can be like you're tired, you're under recovered, you traveled, you fought with your boyfriend or girlfriend or other, right? And so, those signals and building attention around specific, what I call vital signs, or points of awareness is really important. But that's for another completely different podcast. Sorry.
You don't have to pull out. You're speaking my language right now, and it's going to be dangerous because it's going to be a 4-hour podcast if we're not careful.
Yeah, we better end this. But at some point, I I want to talk fancy shoes, fancy.
Yeah. We'll definitely have to have you back. We'll definitely have you on. Jeff, this was phenomenal. I do really quickly before we finish up here, want to give people a location to find you. So DashLX has its own website. There's also an Instagram, Facebook for DashLX. You can be found on Instagram at Jeff Moreno, correct? Is there any other ways to be able to reach out or to find you with some of this cool stuff that you're doing?
They can always, if they have interest or they want to chat about anything, they can always email me at jeff@dashlx.com. And I love to have a chat. So don't be shy.
Yeah. Also, if you got to check out his LinkedIn, I love your profile picture. It just looks so professional, and I'm like, this is a LinkedIn photo. It's great. So you can also find him on LinkedIn. But Jeff, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. What I really love to do is just surf. So if you do go to my LinkedIn, you'll just see a guy surfing and run.
Oh, so that's
day.
What that is. Okay, got it. All right. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. It was awesome to pick your brain and awesome to hear not only what you're doing, but what brands are doing. And it's nice to also know that people do care, right? In a situation where people, where we're having more trouble worldwide with people feeling isolated, there are situations where you can feel a part of something, and you can also know that people do care. And it's not just because they're trying to sell you a product, it's because they want you to be healthy, because we're getting to this point where there is positive in the world. Like longevity is key, and we can do this. Any last words, by the way, before we land this?
No, I think, at some point, people will have more of an opportunity to be a part of these things, and just look out with your favorite brand, and that'll be coming to you soon, hopefully.
Awesome.
Thank you for the opportunity, Matt, and good luck on your research. And hey, let's do a shout out to Rich Willie, because Rich really is. I love Rich. Rich, if you're listening, dude, you got to help Matt out. He needs your help, man.
All right. So we talked about this before, but I'm going to call Rich out. I think, Rich, you talked with, I'm going to leave this on. We'll see if BJ keeps this on here. Rich,
no,
I know you were talking
for sure.
Okay. I know he and Nathan were talking about coming on and doing a podcast. Rich, I don't know if you know this, but I emailed you early on in my PhD asking if you'd be on my PhD committee, which still open offer, by the way, because I'm still looking just to make sure I have a final committee member. But you never responded, so I know you're busy.
Come on, Rich.
No judgment.
Rich, I'm
judgment. It's not like the systematic review I just published, referenced you 40 times or anything like that. It's not you inspired my entire project, but hey, if you're out there, I'm curious. We'd love to have you on too. But
I will connect you to Rich, and Rich is my favorite person. He's one of the most beautiful humans. So he'll get a hold of you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, Matt.
And for those listening, by the way, you got it. Rich Willie is another phenomenal place. But we'll wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. We have, as always, we've got new content coming out every single week, usually released on Wednesday. You can find us on all the different platforms, just like you can find Jeff on all the different platforms, be it LinkedIn, which Bach has done a crazy good job of, Instagram, Facebook, Spotify, all different places, YouTube, that you can consume stuff. Thanks as always for listening. And always, as always, Jeff, thank you for coming on and having a beautiful conversation as always.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.